Hey everyone, welcome to today's Explainer. So, we're looking at something we all pretty much take for granted every single time we glance at a map, but which literally dictates the fate of nations. We're diving into the wild world of borders. Specifically, we're going to look at how these invisible, made-up lines shape massive global tensions and spark lasting conflicts. Seriously, think about this for a second. Every single border out there is, at its core, a fabricated line deciding who controls what side. But, thanks to human nature and some incredibly messy history, we've ended up with a planet carved into roughly 200 sovereign countries by these entirely invented boundaries. So the big question is, what exactly happens when these made-up lines have very real-world consequences? All right, to really get this, let's quickly clarify what we mean when nations clash over their edges. A border dispute is basically just a disagreement between sovereign states over where their territorial lines actually belong. And as you'll see today, these disputes, they don't just happen out of nowhere. They almost always boil down to poorly written historical treaties, greedy colonial ambitions, or just desperate grabs for natural resources. So, to unpack this, we're going to explore three distinct engines of conflict. First, the scars of colonialism. Second, fighting over valuable resources. And third, modern trade and identity. All right, let's jump right into the first one, the scars of colonialism, when map makers miss the mark. It's honestly mind-blowing how a single broken promise can just echo through history. Back in 1859, Britain, who was ruling Belize at the time, struck a treaty with Guatemala. But Britain completely flaked on one specific detail, building a promised connecting road. Because they dropped the ball there, when Belize finally got its independence in 1981, Guatemala just flat out refused to recognize them. They disputed the entire, oddly straight-line border with Belize. Today, Belizeans fiercely defend their independence, and both countries are actually at the International Court of Justice trying to sort it out, all because a road wasn't built like a century and a half ago. Now, this situation perfectly highlights the absolute bizarre paradox of British colonial ambiguity. So Egypt and Sudan both base their border claims on two totally different British interpretations of the 22nd parallel. Naturally, they both want the Halayeb Triangle, which is this highly lucrative 20,000 square kilometer stretch right on the Red Sea. But here's the wild catch. To keep their legal claim for that good land, both countries have to completely ignore and abandon the smaller, barren territory of Bertawil right next door. If either country claimed Bertawil, it would literally invalidate their main case for the territory they actually want. So Bertawil sits there, totally unclaimed by any nation on Earth. And sometimes, borders were just drawn based on straight-up geographical deception. Look at Namibia's Caprivi Strip. It's this bizarre 450-kilometer ribbon of land jutting out to the east. Back in 1890, Britain let Germany have this corridor so the Germans could access the Zambezi River and connect their African colonies. But, and you can't make this up, the British knew full well that the river was completely unnavigable. Why? Because of Victoria Falls. Literally one of the largest waterfalls in the world was right in the way. They intentionally hid that little detail to sell the land. And because of that scam, Namibia today is left with this weird logistical oddity bordering 4 other nations. Okay, moving on to our second driver of conflict, fighting over valuable resources, land worth taking. Let's track the escalating tension over the Essequibo region between Venezuela and Guyana. This massive dispute technically traces all the way back to an 1899 Paris arbitration that handed the territory to British Guyana. At first, both sides were okay with it. But then in the 1960s, right as Guyana was gearing up for independence, Venezuela suddenly revived its claim, basically saying the 1899 ruling was totally rigged in Britain's favor. Fast forward to today, and Guyana has taken it to the International Court of Justice for a final ruling, while Venezuela is insisting they should just hash it out one-on-one without the court. The really crucial point here is that this isn't just some dusty historical debate. It is a massive, high-stakes standoff over incredibly lucrative natural resources. The scale of this territory is just staggering. Essequibo is 160,000 square kilometers. That is more than 2/3 of Guyana's entire landmass. It's absolutely packed with rich mineral deposits and incredibly valuable forests. And the real kicker recently, massive offshore oil discoveries. That oil has dramatically turned up the heat on exactly where this invisible line gets drawn. We see a similar resource struggle in Central Asia, specifically the Fergana Valley. Back in the day, Soviet policies were supposedly designed to create administrative divisions along ethnic lines. But instead, they carved this incredibly complex, fertile valley up between Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, and Tajikistan. What we're left with is this crazy jigsaw puzzle of isolated exclaves, literally chunks of a country entirely marooned inside another country. And in a highly arid region, having a fertile piece of land is an absolute lifeline. Because these convoluted borders physically cut communities off from their parent countries, everyday people just trying to cross these lines for basic agricultural survival find themselves in regular, tense conflicts over resources and governance. It's a textbook example of how lines drawn by bureaucrats far away can totally wreck local survival when border controls get complicated. Let's shift to our final major theme, modern trade and identity, the daily friction. The evolution of the Irish border is such a perfect example of nations trying to balance the deep trauma of historical violence with the modern, desperate need for economic integration. During the late 20th century, an era known as the Troubles, this was a heavily militarized land border dividing the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland. But then, the 1998 Good Friday Agreement brought peace, along with seamless free movement. Fast forward to Brexit. Suddenly, a new customs border with the EU had to go somewhere. To avoid the absolute disaster of bringing back a hard land border, a political compromise essentially stuck the customs border right in the middle of the Irish Sea. It keeps land trade free, but man, it creates some incredibly unique political friction within the UK itself. If you want to know exactly why a hard border there would be a total geopolitical nightmare, just consider the N54 road. This single road literally weaves back and forth between Ireland and Northern Ireland 4 separate times in just a 5-mile stretch. Just imagine the customs and security checkpoints everyday commuters would have to deal with if that became a militarized border again. The communities there are just too deeply blended to be sliced in half. Over in Africa, we see a totally different kind of logistical headache. The artificial colonial split by Britain and France created the Gambia. It's basically a long, thin wedge penetrating right into Senegal. It's less than 50 kilometers wide and is entirely swallowed up by its neighbor, except for the coast. This geography creates constant economic hurdles. Goods have to move between totally different regulatory environments, making trade and travel super cumbersome for citizens who are literally just trying to drive across their own region. They do maintain cooperative relations, which is great, but that border absolutely smothers full regional integration. And sometimes, these ancient lines force countries to build modern engineering marvels just to bypass them. Take the Neum Corridor. It's this tiny strip of coastline granted to Bosnia and Herzegovina way back in a 1699 treaty just to act as a buffer between the Venetian and Ottoman empires. Well, today, that old buffer zone slices right through modern Croatia's coastline. Until very recently, Croatian citizens literally had to cross a foreign border just to travel up their own country's coast. To finally fix this, Croatia had to drop a fortune building the massive Pelješac Bridge, this incredible piece of infrastructure built for no other reason than to bypass a 17th century political compromise. But hey, before we wrap this up, I do want to point out that not all weird borders cause violence or friction. Some actually create amazing collaboration. Take Barle-Hertog and Barle-Nassau. The Belgian and Dutch borders there are so insanely complex, they literally cut right through people's living rooms, based on medieval land deals. Yet the two countries cooperate seamlessly. It's the same in the Middle East, with Mada and Nawa, an Omani exclave completely nested inside a UAE exclave. Because these lines are based on peacefully honored 20th century tribal loyalties, this incredibly complex setup just works, complete with shared roads and totally peaceful joint administration. Which brings us to the final part of our explainer, the future of borders, lines drawn in sand. So, what does this all mean? The big takeaway here is that the 200 or so sovereign nations on our planet are all operating on a really fragile, totally invented framework. Whether a border was defined by a 17th century buffer zone, a colonial scam over a waterfall, or a modern scramble for offshore oil, the lines that dictate our national identities and fuel global conflicts are, at the end of the day, pretty arbitrary. So I'll leave you with this thought to mull over today. What invisible, historical forces are holding the borders of your own country in place? What ancient treaties, local tribal loyalties, or massive colonial blunders are secretly defining the very shape of your homeland right now? Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer. Next time you open up a map, just remember, question the lines.